we are going to learn about DHCP today. Okay, and DHCP is one of the critical roles that has been used since a long time in the infrastructure. So let's learn about how we can configure the DHCP and what is actually DHCP, how the DHCP process works in real environment. So our today's objective, this is going to be covering today. Today we are going to learn about create and configuring scopes, configuring a DHCP reservation, configure DHCP options, configure client and server for PXE boot, and configure DHCP relay agent. Also, we are going to understand what is authorized DHCP server. So these are the points we are going to cover in today's session. Let's begin with the first one, that is create and configure scope. This is about a brief understanding what is DHCP actually. DHCP is basically a service that automatically configures the IP address and other TCP/IP setting on the network computers by assigning the address from a pool called scope. Pool means some bunch of IPs. Okay, that is called a pool. In server form, it is known as scope. In DHCP, it is known as scope. And reclaiming them when they are no longer in use. So DHCP is basically, if you think about a small environment with 20 or 30 men available in a network, if you want to configure the IP address, you have two options. Either you have configured the IP address manually or you have to use DHCP. So DHCP is basically a service that automatically configures the IP addresses, TCP/IP setting for network computers. That means all the computers should have joined through the network to connect a DHCP server. DHCP server then send their IP address to the client machine. So you need not need
some
to.
participants may be experiencing temporary audio issues. Our teams are working to resolve this as quickly as possible.
Okay, and reclaiming them when they are no longer in use. This is also a benefit, that while using DHCP server, you always know that there should be a lease period. A IP which has been reclaimed in today at 10 AM, that should have a expiration date and time. That means that IP should have reserved for that particular client for a limited period of time. After that time, the IP will be automatically released from this pool and distributed to the other clients. So the next option is DHCP consists of three components as follows. So DHCP basically having three components. The first one is a DHCP server application. So what is DHCP server application? Which respond to client requests for TCP/IP configuration setting. So the DHCP server application helps respond the client while they are configuring TCP/IP setting. So now DHCP, the second option is a DHCP client which issues a request to server and the appliance. A DHCP client which issues a request to servers and applies the TCP/IP configuration setting to its receives to the local computer. So this is secondary option. Biswajit, can you please mute yourself? So a DHCP client which issues a request. So DHCP client means the end computer, okay? The client machine send a request to server and applies the configuration, TCP/IP configuration settings received from the server to the local machine. So this is the second option, that DHCP component which is available in client side. The third one is a DHCP communication protocol which defines the format and sequence of the message exchanged by DHCP client and server. So the third one is a secure communication protocol which is dedicated and can be used only by the DHCP, that defines a separate format or sequence of the message to exchange the information between DHCP client and server. All of the Microsoft Windows operating system included DHCP client capabilities. So this is basically what? This is a Windows operating system compatibility part. That means all the Microsoft Windows operating systems include a DHCP client capabilities. That means if you use Windows XP, Windows 7, Windows 8, 8.1, 10, any Windows Server Edition, you should get a default operating system feature which is DHCP client. And all of the server operating system including Windows 2012 include the Microsoft DHCP server option. So server edition operating systems are having another service which is known as DHCP server. And all the workstation class operating system like Windows 7, 10, 8, 8.1, they are getting only DHCP client service available in their services.msc. So let's learn about IP address allocation methods. Okay, how a IP can be allocated from a DHCP server to a DHCP client machine. So we have three type of distribution process. The first one is dynamic allocation. What is dynamic allocation? Dynamic allocation means the DHCP server assign an IP address to a client computer from a scope for a specified length of time. Each client must periodically renew the lease to continue using the address. If the client allows the lease to expire, the address is returned to the scope for reassignment to another client. So this is the basic allocation which is done by DHCP server, and this is known as dynamic allocation process. So IP allocation have three type of process. One is dynamic, second is automatic, and third is manual. So the first one is when you are using a DHCP server, at that time DHCP will distribute the IP address in dynamic allocation method. So a DHCP server can assign IP address to a client computer from a scope, and every IP address should have a specific length of time. Each client must periodically renew the lease to continue using the same IP addresses. If the client allows the lease to expire, that means if the client is shut down, if the client is released, IP has been released from the client machine, the address will return to the server scope and reassignment to another client, and it can be assigned to another client by next moment. Secondary allocation method is known as automatic allocation. So what is automatic allocation? The DHCP server permanently assign an IP address to a client computer from a scope. Once the DHCP server assigns the address to the client, the only way to change the IP address is to manually configure the computer. So what is automatic align? Automatic align means a IP address which has been provided by a DHCP server to a DHCP client for permanently. That means for temporary. It is not temporary within a lease time. It is permanent assignment. Okay. At that time, that deployment or the allocation is known as automatic allocation. We can do that using the configuration chain by unlimited to the lease period, and we can also do that by using DHCP reservation. The third one is manual allocation. The DHCP server permanently assigns a specific IP address to a specific computer on the network. In the Windows Server 2012, DHCP server manually allocate the IP address are called reservations. So this is a manual allocation process. So in DHCP server, if you assign a address permanently to a specific IP address to specific computer. Why it is called specific computer? Because every specific computer have a unique MAC ID, hardware address, physical address. So that physical address will be required when you are trying to do any kind of reservation in DHCP. In the Windows Server 2012 DHCP server, manually allocation address are called reservations. Okay. So in 2012 server, if you want to allocate it manually, then it is known as reservation of IP addresses. So these three are the allocation process available in a DHCP server. Next slide. In this slide, we are going to learn about DHCP message type options. So the DHCP message type options identifies the overall function of the DHCP message, and it required in all DHCP packets as well. The DHCP communication protocol defines 8 different message types as follows. So how a DHCP message can travel over the network from a DHCP server and to DHCP client. This is the process. The short form of this success process is known as DORA. Okay, we will understand what is DORA, but let's learn about the 8 different message types. The first message type, which is going to be in place in case of DHCP client available in a DHCP server environment, that is known as DHCP Discover, used by client to request configuration parameters from a DHCP server. So the first thing is, when you turn on your machine, your Windows 7 client machine on a network, the first thing that your machine will do, it will request the configuration parameter from a DHCP server. How it can identify the DHCP server? It can identify the DHCP server based on the network in which VLAN you are connected and whether there is any DHCP server is available or not. If there is any DHCP server available, then the first process is discover. That means the client has been request their configuration parameters from a DHCP server. The next one is DHCP offer. Used by server, offer a IP address to requesting clients. That means the first process, whoever the IP address try to discover a DHCP server, then DHCP server will offer the IP to the client. The next process is DHCP request, used by a client to accept or renew the IP address assignment. So then once the IP address has been received by the client machine will send again a request to DHCP to assign a lease or renewal request. Then DHCP decline was there, used by DHCP client to reject an offer IP address. If DHCP have already assigned the same IP address to another client machine, then DHCP will decline the request. But if it is free on the scope, then DHCP ACK or DHCP acknowledgement was there, used by a server to acknowledge a client's acceptance of an offer IP address. The next one is DHCP NAC, used by server to reject a client acceptance of an offer IP address. The next process is DHCP release, used by client to terminate an IP address lease. And DHCP inform, used by client to obtain an additional IP address configuration parameter from a server. So this is the 8 different process by which DHCP message travels from DHCP server to DHCP client. The success process, that means a client requests the IP address from a DHCP server check the scope and offer the IP address to the client, then the client requests their lease agreement, then DHCP server will acknowledge the client acceptance and provide the IP address. This is known as DORA. Discover, offer, request and acknowledgement is known as DORA. So whenever you going for an interview for DHCP, always keep in mind that discover process is the beginning of the initiation. So discover can be initiated by a DHCP client machine, not the DHCP server. Okay. Once the discover message comes to the server, then the server, DHCP server, will offer a IP address to the client. Now, once the IP address has been received by the client, then the IP lease will be requested to the DHCP server. If the lease is available to provide, then the DHCP server will acknowledge and provide the lease. If it is not, then the DHCP server will decline the client and reject the offer IP address. And if it is not done, then DHCP NAC will be there. That means the client acceptance, it will reject the client acceptance. Next is DHCP release. A client machine can release their IP address lease time any moment from their command prompt by using ipconfig/release command. The next one is DHCP inform. This is used to obtain a IP address configuration parameters from a server, and we can use it from a client machine by using ipconfig/renew. In the next slide, we are going to learn about BootTP, vendor information extensions. This is one of the important, guys. You have to understand that because you are all going to learn about the position of system administration or Windows Server administration. So you should understand that this option includes many of the basic TCP/IP configuration parameters used by most client systems, such as the following. The first thing is subnet mask, specifying which bit of IP address identifies the host system and which bit of identify as a network system, whereas host system resides. Subnet mask is one of the most important thing in IP addressing because it will help the system identify what are the network address available in the IP address and what are the client system, that means end user address. The next is router. Specify the IP address of the router, that means a default gateway on the local network segment to client should use to transmit to the system to the other network segment. So what it is saying that you should configure the router address, that means the gateway address in the DHCP, by which the client machine can route their traffic from one network to another network. Next is domain naming server, that is known as DNS. Specify the IP address of the server that client will use for DNS name resolution. So in the DHCP, we have to configure the DNS as well, so that the client machine can resolve the DNS name by using the DNS server address. Next is host name. Specify the DNS host name and the client system used. So host name is the default feature. Whenever a client computer try to get a IP address from a DHCP server automatically takes its host name as the identity of the client machine. Domain name. Specify the domain name of the DNS domain on which the system will reside. So whenever you are in a domain network, you should specify the domain name on the DHCP scope to help the client to identify which domain they are belongs to. Now let's learn about DHCP extension. These options are used to provide parameters that govern the DHCP lease, negotiation and renewal process. Requested IP address is used by the client to request a particular IP address from the server. So what is request IP address? Request IP address basically used by the client to request a particular IP address from the DHCP server. IP address lease time. Specify the duration of the dynamically allocated IP address lease. That means if a DHCP server dynamically provide IP address to the clients, the dynamic IP pool should have a lease time specified. Server identifier specifies the IP address of the server involved in a DHCP transmission used by the client to address unicast to the server. So this is very important, guys. Server identifier is very important to stop the broadcast over the network, because when you specify the identified server, it will involve in DHCP transmission and used by the client to address a unicast to the server. That means there will no more broadcast in the network. Parameter request list used by the client to send a list of requested configuration options identified by their code numbers. The server, that means the parameter requested list is used by the client to send a list requested by the configuration option identified by their code number. Each and every offer has their own identified code number to the server. So suppose a client machine try to look up for a DNS. So if it is DNS, then the request should come with the ID number of 11. When the 11 ID comes to the server, it will identify that this is a DNS request and we should send a DNS IP address to the client machine. So this is just for example, guys. Okay, to understand what is the process. So these are the parameter request list. Actually, this is known as parameter request list. Okay. And the next one is message. Used to carry an error message from a server to the client in DHCP NAC message. So if in case DHCP NAC process was initiated by the DHCP server and IP has been declined to provide to the client, In that case, the client machine will get a message that you are no longer permitted to get an IP address from DHCP server. Please contact your local help desk or IT team. Renewal. Renewal time value. That is specifies the time period that must elapse before an IP address lease enters the renewal state. So renewal time value is very important, but because this is the value, suppose you set a value of 24 hours, okay, and you provide the IP address on a client machine, so it will not request the renewal request till the 24-hour complete. So it will only take update from the DHCP server once during the DORA process, and once the DORA is successfully initiated, after that 24 hours, it will not request for any renewal. But once the 24 hours completes, it will automatically send another renewal proposal to the DHCP server. Rebinding time value. The specified the time period that must elapse before an IP address lease enters to is rebinding step. So rebinding means renew. Okay, the same IP address will continue, can be used by the same client. So it specifies the time period that must elapse before an IP address lease enters the rebinding step. How the DHCP lease negotiation works. So as you can see in this diagram, client will first broadcast, which is known as DHCP discover. Server receives the broadcast. Server has IP address available. There should be two conditions, yes or no. If it is no, message describe the transmission is failed. And if the server IP is available on the pool, then server offer the IP address. Once the client accepts the offer address, client broadcasts a DHCP request. Address still available, then the request will be acknowledged. This process is known as DORA. Now, if address passes to the client ARP test, then client will bond transaction successfully. If the ARP has been completed, then the client will able to start accessing the IP address. But if it is no, that means if ARP lookup is failed, the client transmission will decline. Okay, and address declined or transmission failed message will be highlighted on the client machine. So this is the lease negotiation process, guys. Now let's learn about the renewal process. How a client can renew their IP address on a DHCP client, DHCP server. By default, the DHCP server service is Windows Server 2012 use dynamic allocation. Leasing the IP address to the client for 8 days period. This is the default lease configured in Windows Server 2012, that is for 8 days. At periodic intervals during the course of the lease, the client computers to connect the server to renew the lease. So how it is works? The client reaches T1 renewal state, then client unicast the DHCP request to binding server. Binding server is available. If it is available, then server can renew the address. If renew the address has been completed successfully, the server transmits DHCP acknowledgement transition successful. If it is not done, then server transmit the DHCP NAC as least terminated. If the binding server is not available, that means the DHCP server is not available, the client reaches to T2 enter rebinding state, and client will broadcast the DHCP request again for looking for another DHCP server, and if it is answered, responded, then address transmission was successful. If it is not responded, the transmission was failed. So in this session, we have learned about the DHCP service that has automatically configured the IP address and other TCP/IP settings on the network computers by using assign IP address from a pool called scope and reclaim them when they are no longer in use. DHCP consists of three components. One is DHCP server application, DHCP client, and DHCP communication protocol. Next is the DHCP standard defined in different IP address allocation method. One is dynamic, second is automatic, and third is manual allocation process. So that has been done. So guys, if you have any doubts as of now, please let me know. Anywhere you need any additional help to understand